Every few months or so, I get the urge to revisit the Watchmen story, and it's about that time to check in on my old friend. No better time than now to talk about the Comedian, one of the most complex characters in all the DC universe, if you actually consider Watchmen truly a part of it, because it is such a contained story. One graphic novel, and the prolific writer Alan Moore left it at that, while he could have milked this franchise out of all our money. Somehow, Moore left us deeply invested in a character that dies in the opening pages, or opening scene, depending on which medium you prefer. But we get to know him through some detailed flashbacks and exposition. There was a series of comics published a few years ago, called Before the Watchmen, that does add some more backstory to Edward Blake. But out of respect to Alan Moore, who despises its existence, I won't be considering it canon for this video. I just read his thoughts on its release, and geez, companies like DC can be completely immoral when it comes to artistic integrity. It also makes things easier for me, because I honestly haven't read much past the first issue. So with ignoring this comic, as far as we know, Edward Morgan Blake's colorful life begins around the age of 15 or 16, just before the formation of the Minutemen. The leader of this vigilante group, Captain Metropolis, recruited the young but efficient vigilante who went by the name The Comedian, after a lot of the auditions didn't prove fruitful. Edward did die at the age of 61, making him around the age of 15 when the photo capturing their union took place. He must have somehow made a big name for himself in New York, and very early into his career, but he wouldn't last in the Minutemen for very long. During one of the group's gatherings, he assaulted and attempted to rape one of his female teammates, after his gross advances were turned down. Luckily, Sally Jupiter was saved by another member of the Minutemen called Hooded Justice, just in time, which led to the Comedian's removal of the group. Edward laughed it off like he always does, and the public eye never heard the truth of the matter, since Sally wanted it kept quiet to prevent hurting the group's image that was already shaky. While the Comedian is considered one of the heroes in the Watchmen story, he's anything but that. There's no origin story that led up to the kid becoming the Comedian. Before the age of 15, Edward realized that their world and everything about it is a joke. Being a comedian is the only thing that makes sense. Every sick and twisted individual, every horrible act, all a joke. Not the best joke, but he's just playing along with the gag. Edward's justification for all his sadistic, cruel acts is that's what people are deep down inside. If everyone craves to be an asshole, why shy away from it? From what I can tell, he only got the invitation to join the Minutemen because he focused his bloodlust on people who deserved it more than the innocent. He's known for being the guy who cleaned up New York's harbor with a brutal and efficient style. He became proficient with a variety of lethal weapons, as well as hand-to-hand combat, while running around in a yellow and purple costume. It was the late 30s and early 40s, so not the most fashionable time period. Didn't really hide his identity well either, but I don't think that was Edward's biggest concern. We don't get to hear much about the Comedian's feats, since there are so many characters in such a small story, but it is mentioned that the Minutemen focus on taking down underground crime syndicates throughout New York, mainly Moloch the Mystic, the only actual character classified as a supervillain. Not the kind of supervillain you see in other DC comics, a more grounded one. No powers or anything, just a shitty person. In his final days, out of everyone he meets during his travels, Edward decides to confide in Moloch, of all people. I'll get to the details later on, but this shows how alone he was. Not a single friend, lover, or family, or acquaintance in 61 years of living. Just the man he hunted down the most. Over the years after being expelled from the Minutemen, the Comedian continued his vigilante work alone, and has undergone some costume changes too, for the better thankfully. He ditched the yellow and purple and went with a more practical look that provided more protection. And then he got involved with the US government. By this point, you can't really call the Comedian a vigilante. He's just a mercenary, allying himself with whoever grants him the greatest license. It's hinted that he may have been the one responsible for President John F. Kennedy's assassination in this fictional alternate reality. And it's also hinted by Adrian Veidt that he was the one who took out Hooded Justice, the former teammate that stopped Edward from assaulting Sally Jupiter. Adrian would become the Comedian's biggest adversary, unbeknownst to him at the time, in a complicated kind of way. Adrian was a young man who was part of the second wave of vigilantes in the US. He went by Ozymandias. One of his first nights out as a costume adventurer was an investigation into the disappearance of the first ever costumed vigilante, Hooded Justice. This led to a confrontation with the Comedian, who mistook him for an enemy. Adrian was at peak human condition, but was still defeated by the Comedian. While Adrian wants the public to believe this was a mishap, the truth is probably a lot darker, like everything in Watchmen. Adrian would find out Edward was commissioned by the government to look for Hooded Justice, but the comedian reported it as a failed mission. Odds are, he killed Hooded Justice as revenge for the past interference. And Adrian, being the quote-unquote smartest man alive, probably put these pieces together. The comedian wouldn't let the costumed Ozymandias just get away. I think Adrian slipped away after getting his ass beat, because he did have the speed advantage, if not the strength and skill, to outdo him. This sparked Adrian's deep hatred for the comedian, a rare emotion for him being the stoic type. Years later, they would be reunited when the former leader of the now disbanded Minutemen, Captain Metropolis, tried to resurrect another crime-fighting group. But the 60s were very different from the 30s. The meeting ends as a complete failure when the comedian does his whole cynical routine. He is the ultimate cynic after all. He believed nuclear war was imminent, particularly with Russia. Running around in costumes, stopping minor crimes in comparison to all the lives that will be lost in the future was pointless to Edward, and some during this meeting agreed. Amongst these costume vigilantes was his teenage daughter, Lori, using her mother's former epithet of the Silk Spectre. She had no idea the comedian was her father at the time, but he knew the moment he saw her. It's revealed that Sally and Edward had some type of relationship after the initial assault, this time around more consensual. Information Lori was not pleased to receive years later. There are some more interesting interactions in that debacle of a meeting. Our blue god, Dr. Manhattan, is in the room, and dialogue between him and the comedian is always great. Edward is one of the only men Dr. Manhattan calls interesting in the entire graphic novel, the other being Adrian Veidt, saying, "I have never met anyone so deliberately amoral." Pretty good description. The comedian believes a lot of the teammates in the Crime Busters, as well as the Minutemen, were nuts, while considering himself to be sane, keeping things in proportion and trying to see the funny side at all times. As sadistic and mildly psychotic as he comes across, it's like he figured out the world they live in, understanding it better than anyone ever has. His intellect and reasoning is on a whole other level, only rivaled by his teammate on the Crime Busters, Adrian Veidt, who he oddly didn't categorize him as being crazy. I guess it's fitting since he doesn't see himself in that light either. When Rorschach looks back at their interaction, he instantly realized that the comedian understood things everyone knows in their gut, the things everyone is too scared to face. He's a true reflection of his surroundings. Edward figured out that their world and everything about it is a joke. It's best to just live your life as a comedian. This philosophy would be shattered towards the end of his life, however, for decades performing horrible acts on the undeserving. We witnessed the worst of his actions while in Vietnam in 1971 during the war over there. This time around, the government let him participate after leaving masked crime fighters out of World War II, a war Edward actually wanted to take part in. In Vietnam, he formed a relationship with a local girl and wound up impregnating her. After Dr. Manhattan puts a quick end to the war, the woman confronts Edward before he leaves the country forever. When he tries to walk away from his responsibilities, all the while insulting her country, she strikes him with a broken beer bottle. He retaliates by fatally shooting her, ending his unborn child's life in the process.
She was pregnant. And you gunned her down.
That's right. You know what? You watched me.
And this isn't even the only child he killed in Vietnam. He confesses to killing others through unknown means. The bottle slash left him with a memorable scar across his face. This leads to his next costume change. Edward would cover his face entirely instead of just his eyes now. A few years after the war, vigilantism would be outlawed after civil unrest. Doc and the comedian are the only vigilantes that agreed to work for the US government when the law passed. A perfect situation for Edward since now he had more resources to enable his cruelty. He grew close with the Nixon administration, and during one of the missions, he came across a suspicious island during the 80s in the Pacific Ocean, so decided to make a pit stop. This was Adrian Veidt's private island that he was using to plan out how he would stop a nuclear disaster. The scheme was to fake an attack from an alien squid on New York. Well, that's in the comics. The movie replaced this part with a fake Dr. Manhattan attack. Adrian's plan would leave millions of innocent civilians dead in order to unite the world against a common enemy. This plan was in fact inspired by the comedian's speech about the inevitability of nuclear war destroying the planet during the first failed Crime Busters meeting. Adrian was set on not having the comedian have the last laugh. This sick plot broke the comedian. Everything he thought he understood about mankind and the world was wrong. People like Adrian Veidt are capable of much worse than the average man. This shock brought out a side of Edward we never see again, an emotional, weeping character, confused and scared. The comedian no longer found the joke funny. This is when he breaks into his former enemy, Moloch's home. Desperate for someone to lean on, a drunken Edward revealed too much. In a house Adrian kept bugged. Left with no choice, Adrian faced off against the man he hated most once again. This time on his terms, where he would have the upper hand in a surprise attack. It didn't seem like Edward had any plans to stop Adrian's scheme. He probably just sat in his luxurious apartment all week, paid for by all his mercenary gigs, brooding over the depressing information he stumbled across. Edward Blake was killed by Adrian Veidt, so his plot would go smoothly, undiscovered by the public, and this kicks off the events of the story. But what he didn't account for was Rorschach's journal that would live on, even though the squid attack was seemingly a success. Crazy to think the story came out in '86 with how well it holds up, a testament to some truly timeless writing. But now I've talked about the 4 biggest players in the Watchmen story. That leaves only poor Night Owl and Laurie. Not the most interesting duo, so I think I'll let this series die here with the comedian. Thanks for watching, guys.